Section 14 of T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Moon of Rochester, New York. T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas de Witt Talmage. The Eighth Milestone, Part 2. Mr. Vanderbilt, converted into a philanthropist, gave $500,000 to a medical institute, and the world began to see new possibilities in great fortunes. That a railroad king could also be a Christian king was a hopeful tendency of the times. These were the acts that tended to smother the activities of communism in America. In the previous 4 years, the curious astronomer had discovered the evolution of a new world in the sky, and so while on the earth there were convulsions, in the skies there were new beauties born. With the rising sun of the year 1885, one of our great and good men of Brooklyn saw it with failing eyesight. Dr. Noah Hunt Schenck, pastor of St. Anne's Episcopal Church, was stricken. For 15 years he had blessed our city with his benediction. The beautiful cathedral, which grew to its proportions of grandeur under Dr. Schenck's pastorate, stood as a monument to him. A few weeks later, Schuyler Colfax, Speaker of the House of Representatives, passed on. In the vortex of political feeling, his integrity was attacked, but I never believed a word of the accusations. 10 millions of people hoped for his election as president. He was my personal friend. When the scandal of his life was most violent, he explained it all away satisfactorily in my own house. This explanation was a confidence that I cannot break, but it made me ever afterwards a loyal friend to his memory. He was one of those upon whom was placed the burden of living down a calumny, and when he died, Congress adjourned in his honor. Members of the legislature in his own country gathered about his obsequies. I have known many men in public life, but a more lovable man than Schuyler Colfax I never knew. The generous words he spoke of me on the last Sabbath of his life I shall never forget. The perpetual smile on his face was meanly caricatured, and yet it was his benediction upon a world unworthy of him. In 1885, from far away over the sea came muffled thunder tones of war and rebellion. The deadly nightshade was indigenous to our times. The dynamite outrages at Westminster Hall and the House of Commons were explosions we in America heard faintly. Their importance was exaggerated. 100 years back, the kings of England, of France, of Russia, who died in their beds, were rare. The violent incidents of life were less conspicuous as the years went on. What riots Philadelphia had seen during the old firemen's battle in the streets, and those theatrical riots in New York, when the military was called out and had to fire into the mob because the friends of Macready and Forrest could not agree as to which was the better actor. An alarming number of disputes came up at this time over wills. The orphan courts were overworked with these cases. I suggested a rule for all wills, 1/3 at least to the wife, and let the children share alike. When a child receives more than a wife, the family is askew. A man's wife should be first in every ambition, in every provision. 1/3 to the wife is none too much. The worst family feuds proceed from inequality of inheritance. This question of rights under testamentary gifts of the rich was not so important, however, as the alarming growth in our big cities of the problem of the poor. The tenement house became a menace to cleanliness. Never before were there so many people living in unswept, unaired tenements. Stairs below stairs, stairs above stairs, where all the laws of health were violated. The Sanitary Protective League was organized to alleviate these conditions. Asiatic cholera was striding over Europe, and the Tenement House of America was a resting place for it here. After a lecturing trip in the spring of 1885 through Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin, I returned to Brooklyn, delighted with the confidence with which the people looked forward to the first Cleveland administration. On the day that $50 million was voted for the River and Harbor Bill, both parties sharing in the spoils, American politics touched bottom. There were symptoms of a recuperation in Mr. Cleveland's initiative. Belligerency was abandoned as a hopeless campaign. The graceful courtesy with which President Arthur bowed himself out of the White House was unparalleled. Never in my memory was a scepter so gracefully relinquished. Nothing in his 3.5 years of office did him more credit. I think we never had a better president than Mr. Arthur. He was fortunate in having in his cabinet as chief advisor Mr. Frederick T. Frelinghuysen. My office as a minister compelled me to see, first and foremost, the righteous uplift of the events as I passed along with them. These were not always the most conspicuous elements of public interest, but they comprised the things and the people I saw. I recall, for instance, chief amongst the incidents of Mr. Cleveland's administration, that the oath of office was administered upon his mother's Bible. Many people regarded this as mere sentimentality. To me, it meant more than words could express. The best of Bibles is the mother's. It meant that the man who chose to be sworn in on such a book had a grateful remembrance. It was as though he had said, if it had not been for her, this honor would never have come to me. For all there is of actual solemnity in the usual form of taking an oath, people might just as well be sworn in on a city directory or an old almanac. But as I said then, I say now, make way for an administration that starts from the worn and faded covers of a Bible presented by a mother's hand at parting. Mr. Blaine's visit to the White House to congratulate the victor, his cordial reception there, and his long stay, was another bright side of the election contest. There must have been a good deal of lying about these two men when they were wrestling for the honors, for if all that was said had been true, the scene of hearty salutation between them would not only have been unfit, but impossible. All this optimism of outlook helped to defeat the animosity of the previous campaign. A crowning influence upon the national confusion of standards was the final unanimous vote in Congress in favor of putting General Grant on the retired list, with a suitable provision for his livelihood, in view of a malady that had come upon him. It had been a long, angry, bitter debate, but the generous quality of American sympathy prevailed. Men who fought on the other side and men who had opposed his presidential policy united to alleviate his sickness, the pulsations of which the nation was counting. President Arthur's last act was to recommend General Grant's relief, and almost the first act of Mr. Cleveland's administration was to ratify it. Republics are not ungrateful. The American Republic subscribed about $400,000 for the relief of Mrs. Garfield, voted pensions for Mrs. Polk and Mrs. Tyler, some years ago subscribed $250,000 for General Grant, and increased it by vote of Congress in 1885. The conqueror on the pale horse had already taken many prisoners among the surviving heroes of the war. It was fitting that he should take his coming upon the great leader of the Union Army as gentle as the south wind. There was a surplus of men fit for official position in America when the hour of our new appointments arrived. There were hundreds of men competent to become ministers to England, to France, to Germany, to Russia, as competent as James Russell Lowell or Mr. Phelps. This was all due to the affluence of American institutions that spread the benefits of education broadcast. I remember when Daniel Webster died, people said, "We shall have no one now to expound the Constitution." But the chief expositions of the Constitution have been written and uttered since then. There were pygmies in the old days, too. I had a friend who, as a stenographer some years ago, made a fortune by knocking bad grammar out of the speeches of congressmen and senators who were illiterate. They said to him haughtily, "Stenographer, here are a couple of $100. Fix up that speech I made this morning and see that it gets into the congressional record all right. If you can't fix it up, write another." In 1885, there were plenty of women, too, who understood politics. There were mean and silly women, of course, but there was a new race springing up of grand, splendid, competent women, with a knowledge of affairs. The appointment of Mr. Cox as minister to Turkey was a compliment to American literature. In consequence of a picturesque description he gave of some closing day in a foreign country, he was facetiously named Sunset Cox. I rechristened him Sunrise Cox. When President Tyler appointed Washington Irving as minister to Spain, he set an example for all time. Men of letters put their blood into their inkstands, but the sacrifice is poorly recognized. Some of us were faintly urging worldwide peace, but around the night sky of 1885 was the glare of many campfires. Never were there so many wars on the calendar at the same time. The Sudan War, the threat of a Russo-English war and of a Franco-Chinese war, the South American War, the Colombian War, all the nations restless and arming. The scarlet rash of international hatred spread over the earth, and there were many predictions. I said then it was comparatively easy to foretell the issue of these wars, excepting one. I believed that the revolutionist of Panama would be beaten, the half-breed overcome by the Canadian, that France would humble China, but that the Central American War would go on and stop, and go on again and stop again, until, discovering some Washington or Hamilton or Jefferson of its own, it would establish a United States of South America corresponding to the United States of North America. The Sudan War would cease when the English government abandoned the attempt to fix up in Egypt things unfixable. But what would be the result of the outbreak between England and Russia was the war problem of the world. The real question at issue was whether Europe should be dominated by the lion or the bear. In the United States, we had no internal frictions which threatened us so much as rum and gambling. In Brooklyn, we never ceased bombarding these rebellious agents of war on the character of young men. Coney Island was once a beautiful place, but in the 5 years since that time, when it was a garden by the sea, the races at Brighton Beach and Sheepshead Bay had been established. In New York and Brooklyn, pool rooms were open for betting on these races. In 10 years' time, I predicted that no decent man or woman would be able to visit Coney Island. The evil was stupendous, and the subject of Coney Island could no longer be neglected in the pulpit. Betting was a new fashioned sort of vice in America in 1885. It was just becoming a licensed relaxation for young boys. As the years went on, it has grown to great distinction in all forms of American life, but it was yet only at its starting point in this year. Looking over an address I made on this subject, I find this statement: "What a spectacle, when at Saratoga or at Long Branch or at Brighton Beach the horses stop, and in a flash $50,000 or $100,000 change hands. Multitudes ruined by losses, others ruined by winnings." Many years afterwards, the money involved in racing was in the millions, but in 1885, 100,000 was still a good bit. There were 3 kinds of betting at the horse races then: by auction pools, by French mutuals, and what is called bookmaking. All of these methods controlled for a consideration. The pool seller deducted 3 or 5% from the winning bet, incidentally ringing up more tickets than were sold on the winning horse, while the bookmaker, for special inducement, would scratch any horse in the race. The jockey also, for a consideration, would slacken speed to allow a prearranged winner to walk in while the judges on the stand turned their backs. It was just a swindling trust. And yet these racetracks on a fine afternoon were crowded with intelligent men of good standing in the community, and frequently the parasols of the ladies gave color and brilliancy to the scene. Our most beautiful watering places were all but destroyed by the racetracks. To stop all this was like turning back the ocean tides, so regular became the habit of gambling, of betting, of being legally swindled in America. No one was interested in the evils of life. We were on the frontier of a greater America, a greater waste of money, a greater paradise of pleasure. Some notice was taken of General Grant's malady, mysteriously pronounced incurable. The bulletins informed us that his life might last a week, a day, an hour, and still the famous old warrior kept getting better. One moment Grant was dying, the next he was dining heartily at his own dinner table. This was one of the mysteries of the period. Personally, I believe that the prayers of the Church kept him alive. In April 1885, the huge pedestal for the wonderful Statue of Liberty presented to us by the citizens of France was started. That which Congress had ignored and the philanthropists of America had neglected, the masses were doing by their modest subscription. $1 from the men, 10 cents from the children. All Europe, wrapped in war cloud, made the magnificence and splendor of our enlightened liberty greater than ever. It was time that the gates of the sea, the front door of America, should be made more attractive. Castle Garden was a gloomy corridor through which to arrive. I urged that the harbor fortresses should be terraced with flowers, fitting the approach to the forehead of this continent that Bartholdi was to illumine with his coronet of flame. The Bartholdi statue, as we read and heard and talked about it, became an inspired impulse to fine art in America. In the right hand of the statue was to be a torch, in the left hand a scroll representing the law. What a fine conception of true liberty! It was my hope, then, that 50 years after the statue had been placed on its pedestal, the foreign ships passing Bedloe's Island by that allegory should ever understand that in this country it is liberty according to the law. Life, as we should live it, is strong, according to our obedience to its statutes. In my boyhood this was impressed upon me by association and example. When in May 1885 Frederick T. Frelinghuysen, ex-Secretary of State, died, I was forcibly reminded of this fact. I grew up in a neighborhood where the name of Frelinghuysen was a synonym for purity of character and integrity. There were Dominie Frelinghuysen, General John Frelinghuysen, Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen, and Frederick Frelinghuysen, the father of Fred, as he was always known in his home state. When I was a boy, Fred Frelinghuysen practiced in the old Somerville courthouse in New Jersey, and I used to crowd in and listen to his eloquence, and wonder how he could have composure enough to face so many people. He was the king of the New Jersey bar. Never once in his whole lifetime was his name associated with a moral disaster of any kind. Amid the pomp and temptations of Washington, he remained a consistent Christian. All the feloniousness were alike, grandfather, grandson, and uncle. On one side of the sea was the Prime Minister of England, Gladstone. On the other side was Secretary of State Frelinghuysen, two men whom I associate in mutual friendship and esteem. Towards the end of June 1885, we were tremendously excited. All one day long the cheek of New York was flushed with excitement over the arrival of the Bartholdi statue. Bunting and banners canopied the harbor, fluttered up and down the streets, while minute guns boomed and bands of music paraded. We had miraculously escaped the national disgrace of not having a place to put it on when it arrived. It was a gift that meant European and American fraternity. The $100,000 contributed by the masses for the pedestal on Bedloe's Island was an estimate of American gratitude and courtesy to France. The statue itself would stand for ages as the high water mark of civilization. From its top, we expected to see the bright tinge of the dawn of universal peace. End of section 14.